let's explain what parashiyot are. And it's actually not as simple as it might seem. But let's explain it this way. So we have the chapters in our English Bibles. And chapter divisions were invented, with the exception of Psalms. The chapter divisions were invented in the Tanakh by a man named Bishop Stephen Langton in the 13th century. He was Archbishop of Canterbury. And he divided the Bible based on, he tried to have more or less uniform sections so that every week in his church they could read a section, right? And they would read section 1 of, chapter 1 of Genesis, chapter 2, chapter 3, etc. Well, in the Hebrew manuscripts, we don't have these. Certainly in the early Hebrew manuscripts. Later they were added in under the Christian influence. But we don't have these chapter divisions. What we have are parashiyot. And now I did a series called Torah Pearls, where we talked about parashah, which is a section or a division. It's actually from the same root as the word Pharisee, because Pharisee is proshi. It's one who divides himself, who separates himself off from the multitudes. And it was meant in the sense in the word Pharisee for holiness, right? Just like the word holy means to separate something. It means to set it aside and above. So Pharisee meant somebody who set himself aside and above, or certainly aside from the people the multitudes who they considered to be unclean, or more specifically, didn't follow all these rules and regulations related to tithes and the sabbatical years. That's really what Pharisee meant, and ritual cleanliness. So parashah, in respect of the text, is a section that's set aside. And what it really is we've broken up the Torah into 54 sections, and each week we read a different section. That was a tradition that goes back to the Jews of Babylonia. It's called the Babylonian annual cycle. There was another cycle called the triennial cycle, where they break up the Torah into about 154 sections and read it over a period of 3 or 3.5 years. That's not what this word parashah means. That's parashah and parashah, but the word parashah is often used in this context as well. This parashah, or parshiyah, refers to spaces in the manuscripts, and these are much older than the division into 54 or 150. When the text was originally written, there were spaces in the manuscripts, and the scribes, when they would copy the Torah, or the entire Tanakh, they would try to preserve those spaces. We see those spaces in the Dead Sea Scrolls. They don't always match exactly the spaces we have today, but they were striving for spaces like that. And there's two types of spaces. And why are the spaces important? Because they tell you, pause here. We're setting this apart. This is the end of a thought, the end of a section. The 10 Commandments, each one of the 10 Commandments are separated by a space, right? So it doesn't have to be a whole new chapter like in our Archbishop Stephen Langton chapters that we have today, right? It should just be, okay, do not murder, do not steal, do not commit adultery. Each one of those has a parashiyah. Now, there was a rule that in order for the Torah scroll to be valid, when you read from it in the synagogue, the parashiyot, that is these spaces within the manuscripts, also called parashah, they had to be copied exactly right. To the point where if you're in a synagogue today, an Orthodox synagogue for sure, and they're reading from the Torah scroll, and they all of a sudden realize, oh, the space here is an open space instead of a closed space. Those are the two types of spaces in this period and in these manuscripts. There are other kinds in other contexts. In Northern Europe, or in Europe in general, there are different types of spaces. But in the Oriental scrolls, there are open and closed spaces. And if you had an open space instead of a closed space, or a closed space instead of an open space, then it makes the scroll invalid. Now, Nelson, behind your head, we can actually see open and closed spaces. I just realized. You have behind you what I believe is the Great Isaiah Scroll, am I right? 1Q Isaiah A. And you see those spaces. That's in the Isaiah scroll from 2,200 years ago. So those were reproduced in the Torah scrolls. And Maimonides comes along and he says, look, if you don't have the spaces exactly right, you have to, I started to say it, to this day, you're reading in the synagogue and somebody says, oh, there's an open space instead of a closed space, or a closed space instead of an open space. And that's what we wrote here as stumotim ptuchot. Stumot are closed and ptuchot are opened, open spaces. And it's a bit complicated what that means. An open space means, and I'll say kind of, sort of, there are nuances here I'm not going to get into, but basically an open space means the text is written, and then there's a space that continues all the way to the end of the line, and the new text begins in the next line. That's an open space. A closed space is the text is written, there's a space, and then the new text begins in the same line. And there are exceptions. What if you end at the end of a line? Well, we're not going to get into that, right? But basically, there's open and closed spaces. And it's kind of assumed that an open space is a greater break than a closed space. But I don't know if that's necessarily true. These are kind of like paragraph spacings. But they definitely say, okay, this is the end of a thought, and now it's a new thought. And that can be really important. You're reading a biblical passage, and you think, oh, verse 2 is related to verse 3 because they're in the same chapter. And you find out verse 2 is the continuation of the last 4 chapters, and the space is after verse 2. And that whole section, going back several chapters in the modern chapter system, is all one continuous text. And then verse 3 is the beginning of a new thought. And those spaces tell you that. So if you're reading in the synagogue today and you have the wrong spacing, they stop the reading in the middle of the ritual, in the middle of the service. They roll up the scroll, they put it on the side, and they take out a new scroll. Because the reading isn't considered valid if the scroll doesn't have the spacing exactly right. To this day.
One of the lasting things I remember about you talking about this subject and how they relate to the literary structure is, I can't remember if it was in Torah prose or prophet prose, but I remember you talking about how, especially in prophecies, in sections of the prophets, you can actually connect prophecies together based off of their breaks.
Right.
And this had a lasting impression on me because you described how in Bible translations, they will actually interpret the breaks in the paragraphs in the manuscripts, and they will create a whole new chapter. And so if you're reading this only through a translation, and you come to a new chapter, in your mind, you're thinking, okay, we've moved on from that prophecy, or we've moved on from that section. Now we're on to something else. But what the open and closed sections might demonstrate is that where in English you think, okay, we're moving on to something else, they may actually be connecting something that was previously said.
Right. That's a place where you see that, I think where I've seen it the most is in the book of Isaiah. So in Isaiah, you have a lot of very short prophecies that are 2 or 3 verses. You see it in Jeremiah too. You have a lot of very short prophecies that are maybe 2 or 3 verses, and you'll have an entire chapter which has 10 prophecies, and you think they're all the same prophecy, and they don't even make sense because you're like, what did this verse have to do with the next verse? We're talking about something completely different. Yeah. It's just a different prophecy. And a lot of times in Hebrew, those are strung together because there's a word in the first prophecy that appears in the second prophecy. So it's like the principle of association. And the prophecies have actually nothing to do with each other except for that they share a common word. And so they were kind of arranged in that way because it's easier to remember them that way. And so that's a major issue in, so these are actually very important, these open and closed sections.
Yes, sir.